three broad categories. The first category are those sermons that are specifically aimed to build up our faith. Stop and think about the Old Testament reading for today. The Old Testament reading for today talked about the promises that God made to Abraham. Promises that had not come into effect yet and probably wouldn't be coming into effect for a number of years. And yet, Abraham was simply willing to trust in God, to trust that God would carry through and do what God said he was going to do. And so, to us, the message is, listen. Listen to what God has promised. Listen to what God has promised you. If he carried out and fulfilled his promises to Abraham, yes, he will fulfill his promises to you. Simply trust. Trust in him. The Old Testament lesson said that simple faith, that simple trust in God was counted to Abraham's credit as righteousness. The epistle lesson for today really holds up a number of heroes of faith, people that were willing to trust in God. Some of them simply laid their lives into God's hands. Some of them simply laid their future into God's hands. Abel. Enoch. Enoch was the guy who was simply taken up by God, who never faced death. Noah. Abraham. Sarah. All of these people were called upon simply to trust in the promises of God. And Hebrews says these are really heroes of the faith. These are people that we ought to emulate. We ought to do what they did and simply put ourselves into the hands of God, simply to trust in God. The other category of faith, and you're probably not going to find this in any theology book, is a kind of sermon that I would describe as the therefore sermon. God has not only made promises to us, he's carried through on them. God sent his Son into this world for us, for our sake. God did the heavy lifting. He took care of the whole question of forgiveness, of salvation, for us. Therefore, since God has already done that, therefore, this is how we respond to what God has done. Therefore, we live out our faith in terms of our life. And so this kind of sermon really would speak to how we live, how we carry out our lives in response to the gospel. And as soon as you say therefore, you've already implied there was something that went before it. In this particular case, it's interesting, if you look at the context of the passage in the Bible, what went before it was the story of the gospel from last week. The story that Jesus told about the rich man. About the rich man who had such a bumper crop that he didn't have any place to store it. I've seen that happen on one occasion down in the valley. They had such a bumper crop of grain sorghum that the silos were filled up. There was no place to put it. And so finally they just spread some tarps on the ground and piled up the grain sorghum on the ground until they could get enough rail cars in to carry it away. Well, that's the kind of thing that happened to the fellow in the story that Jesus told. There was just so much. What's he going to do with it? Well, he said, I don't have the storage facilities for it, so I'll tear down what I've got, and I'll build some really enormous barns, and I'll store it there. And in the story that Jesus was telling, he said, God caused a guy to have a heart attack that night. Now, who does all that stuff belong to? Well, the family's going to be fighting over it for the next 30 years, probably. His idea of his worth was bound up in how much he could stuff in the barns that he built. That was his definition of his value. The interesting thing is, the real point of the parable is we have to be willing to turn loose, to loosen our grip on our stuff. On several occasions, Susan and I had orders overseas. First to Newfoundland and then to Iceland. And when you move overseas, the government comes in and packs everything you own in these gigantic overseas crates. And then they're loaded on a ship, on a truck and hauled off to be shipped to wherever you're going to go. One of the families that we ran into had lost everything. The ship had gone down and had taken with it everything that they had accumulated throughout their lives. All that they had left over was what they had in their suitcases. That got me to thinking, what is really irreplaceable in our lives? You know, our furniture is basically early attic. And I figure the clothes that fit are the ones that are in style. And I would hate to lose my books, but my wife says most of them you could really do without, and we would be better off if they all went down on the ship. When you come right down to it, there is not a great deal in our lives that isn't replaceable. Family heirlooms and the pictures of the kids when they're little. And nowadays, most of the people have those on their iPhone. Therefore, God says, don't worry. Don't worry if the ship goes down. Your wife is already out buying the stuff that she always wanted. Therefore, don't worry. Listen, that is a lot harder to do than to say. I don't know about you, but I'm probably a world-class worrier. I mean, when I leave home in the morning, I worry about, did I unplug the coffee pot? In fact, on more than one occasion, I've turned around and gone back just to check to make sure that I unplugged the coffee pot. And when my wife is a few minutes late from a shopping expedition, I worry that she's worn all the numbers off the credit card. When the kids were little, I certainly used to worry about the kids. But now that we have grandchildren, that just has expanded the horizons of my worrying. So, when you come right down to it, I worry about things. Patrick McManus, the humor writer who grew up in the western United States, says, our vat of worry really is finite, you know? If you get a new worry, you got to drop one of the old ones. My vat is filled up all the time. Therefore, God says, don't worry. Why not worry? God says, I've got this. I will take care of you. He said, in the gospel lesson for today, stop and think about the birds. The birds don't plant anything. They don't harvest anything. And yet they always seem to find something to eat. Think about the flowers, he says. Some of the flowers are more gorgeous than Solomon in all of his glory. If God can look after birds and plants, don't you think that he can look after us? Don't worry. Of course, that doesn't mean that we're going to be rolling in wealth. No. Remember our prayer in the Lord's Prayer. Give us this day our daily bread. Actually, a more accurate translation would probably give us day by day our bread. Give us that which is sufficient for us. Give us that which is sufficient. We have to learn to be content. We have to loosen our grip and all of the stuff. But you know, that what goes in front of the therefore is really more than a story about a rich guy. What is really in front of the therefore is that all that God has done for us. God has sent his Son into this world, and it was a very real world. It was a world, like we talked about last Sunday, of immigration and slavery and robbery. And the Lord had to cope with all of those things. He also had to cope with people who were struggling to earn a living. And people that were raising kids. And people that were facing sickness and death. It was a very real world that he was a part of. Just like the world that you and I live in. And ultimately, he gathered up all of the hurts, all of the failures, all of the pains of his world and ours, and carried them to the cross. The world in which Jesus lived turned against him and put him to death. And it was that suffering, that death, and ultimately that resurrection that reconciled you and me to God. That's what really is in front of all of the therefores in our lives. Yeah. We have to earn a living. We have to pay the bills. We have to worry about the children's education and now the grandchildren's education. We have to do all of the things that make up our world. All of the things that it takes to get from Monday to Friday. But in the process, remember that Sunday is coming. Sunday is coming. And Sunday says to us, loosen your grip. Trust in God. Sunday is coming. Sunday reminds us to seek first the kingdom of God. And what does that mean? How do we seek first the kingdom of God? We simply live out of faith. What does that look like? What does that look like on a day-by-day existence? What's it called to be faith-filled husbands, faith-filled wives? To be faith-filled children of families and of God? It means to be a faith-filled employer or a faith-filled employee. When you come right down to it, it means simply that our lives become an expression of a response to the gospel, to what God has already done. So, how much are you worth? Well, when somebody asks that question, you start toting up how much you have in the bank, how much your house is worth, how much, all of the things that contribute to the finances. How much are you worth? God says, sort of tongue in cheek, well, you're worth more than birds. And you certainly are. You are people for whom God himself died. Don't worry. God says, I've got this. Amen. Let's continue our worship with the offering.